From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about being on the front lines of the battle against malnutrition.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our new president of the Danforth Plant Science Center, Jim Carrington. He joined us earlier this month, May 1st to be exact, from Oregon State University, and we are going to be hearing a lot from Jim over the next years and years. But tonight I want to give those of you who haven't had a chance to meet him a chance to let him introduce himself and tell you about his joining the Danforth Plant Science Center. So thank you all again for coming, and Jim, let me...
Thank you, Robin. First of all, let me thank Robin and the Friends Committee. This is a wonderful event. This is my first conversation, and I'm happy it's on such an intelligent topic. In fact, some people might even say that this is my first intelligent conversation. And I'm really happy that it's happening here. So thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Danforth Center. For those of you who have only come for the conversation, I hope you return, if you haven't already, and take a tour of the building. You're welcome anytime. Just give us a call and we'll set it up. You can see facilities, you can meet the scientists. And my door, it turns out, is always open. So if I'm in there, stop by and I'll be happy to meet you, if I don't meet you tonight. I also found out that you just saw all of Oregon's weather in the last 3 days. This was very comforting. Ernan, one of the scientists in my group, I see is here tonight. He can attest to this. Over the weekend, you had overcast, drizzly. Oh, it's going to stop. Let's go outside. Oh no, it's starting to drizzle again, and it goes on like that for 6 months in Oregon. And then one day, it's like it was yesterday and today. It's sunny, it's wonderful, and you realize what nice weather really is. So I assume it will stay like this all year round here. I don't really have anything more to say. I'm kind of filling in space here. But I'm really happy to introduce and to turn the podium over to Jim Davis. Jim is the moderator, as most of you know. Jim's been doing this for 6 years. I met him for the first time this evening. But I feel like I know him because I've watched many of these conversations on video. And if you want to review one of these, just go to the danforthcenter.org website, and we post these. And it's a wonderful resource, and it's one of the more visible and interesting things that you can find as part of the public who's interested in plant science on our website. So with that, I'll turn the stage over to Jim and the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to welcome our new president here at the Plant Science Center, and of course I'm delighted to welcome such a large audience. It's a serious problem we're going to talk about tonight, and I'm glad to see that so many people are interested in it. I'm joined by two remarkable panelists. On my far right, Hannah Hightower, and on my immediate right, Dr. Mark Maneri. Hannah is a first. I've been doing this for 6 years, as Jim Carrington said, and I think it's the first time we've had a high school student on the panel. But I think you'll discover that Hannah is quite a remarkable young woman and will be an able panelist.
I'll do what I can. That's all I can say.
Hannah will be a senior in Visitation Academy next year. And then hopes for a career after her education is complete in international business. She was a member of the junior board of the Plant Science Center's commemoration on World Food Day, and she was here actively packing packages of food to be sent overseas. She was sufficiently, it's tempting to say, became passionately interested in problems of hunger and malnutrition, and gathering her own resources, she traveled for 2 or 2.5 weeks to Tanzania, the country where we had shipped food to. So in Tanzania, she could learn firsthand about the problem of malnutrition, particularly childhood malnutrition. Well, I want to ask a question. I want to ask about her interest in hunger when we come to the conversation part. She's also a lifeguard in a swimming program for developmentally disabled children. She's clearly committed to public service and very interested in the problems we're dealing with tonight. On my immediate right is Dr. Mark Maneri, who for many of you needs no introduction. 4 or 5 years ago, he was a panelist on this program. Dr. Maneri is an expert in child nutrition. He's professor of pediatrics at Washington University Medical School and also senior lecturer in pediatrics at the Medical College of Malawi in Africa. In addition to practicing medicine and focused on malnutrition, perhaps 10 or 12 years ago, he developed a peanut butter mix. It's not only peanut butter, but peanut butter is a main ingredient that is a ready-to-use therapeutic food. The initials, I know are an acronym, RUTF, but try as I might, I can't pronounce it as a 4-letter word. Do you pronounce RUTF?
Artoof.
Artoof? Is that new this evening?
No.
But in addition to traveling frequently to Africa, where he works and has certainly assisted thousands of children, with the mix he gives, increases rapid growth in severely malnourished children. It's probably one of the most remarkable products developed, and it can use local products grown on site. They don't have to be imported. Dr. Maneri is also director of the Global Harvest Alliance, that is a collaborative involving Children's Hospital here in St. Louis, Washington University, and of course the Danforth Plant Science Center. The mission of the Danforth Plant Science Center includes, of course, feeding the hungry. Well, with 2 different but 2 capable panelists, let's go with the conversation. And I have a question immediately for Hannah.
All right.
I know lots of high school seniors who aren't particularly interested in hunger except theirs.
Don't worry, I do too. That
Or
basically describes
never
all my
mind,
friends.
childhood malnutrition. What got you interested in hunger?
Well, mainly my work with the Danforth Center's junior board, and as a board member, I was responsible for organizing high school volunteers, increasing awareness, and participating in the packaging event we had last October. And one thing that really got me interested in food is I cook a lot. I'll be the first person to tell you, I'm always in the kitchen. And so besides, just feeding my friends and feeding my family, the fact that I was able to feed children and adults, so far away who desperately needed the nutrition, that really resonated with me. And I love to help people, and I love to just go out in the community and do good things. And so this is my passion. It just hit the nail on the dot. Loved it.
And what did you learn when you went to Tanzania? You
What
saw
did I
things
learn?
firsthand, yeah.
Oh golly, I learned so much. I learned that Yanya is tomato in Swahili. I got a horrendous sunburn, and so I was referred to as, Yanya, tomato. So that was number one. The main thing that I learned while I was there is the effect that malnutrition and hunger has on the development of a community. I've worked a lot with children, and I met a lot of children that had to resort to thievery or, in certain cases, prostitution, or working in mines or in other deplorable conditions just so they can feed their families and put food on the table. And I couldn't find that acceptable, and that just really hit me hard. But that was the number one thing I learned. I thought that, I knew that there were issues and implications of a child being malnourished in regards to their personal health, but to see the effect on an overall community just really was something else.
Mm-hmm.
Truly, truly interesting.
Well, Dr. Maneri, let me switch to you. A doctor could practice pediatrics in this country for a long time and probably never see malnutrition. What got you interested in childhood malnutrition?
Well, right after my training, my wife and I went to Tanzania, and we worked in a hospital there for a couple of years. And just in my nature and my character, I really want to work on the most important things and the problem, and it doesn't really matter a lot if I have a particular background or interest or training in it. I usually just gravitate toward the biggest problem. So on a faculty exchange program in '94 in Malawi, it was just evident that was the biggest reason kids were sick in Malawi. And so I said, well, let's take this on.
Food's the best medicine.
Potentially, yeah.
And you've taken it on ever since.
Yeah, the work's not done, so we haven't left yet.
Can you, this may be a question for either of you, but primarily probably for Dr. Maneri, can you describe a bit the extent of hunger, the seriousness of one, hunger, and two, childhood hunger, either across the globe or focused particularly in Africa? How much is there? How big is the problem?
Well, over half of child deaths in this world are because children don't get enough to eat, not because of something else and children don't get enough to eat. So we're talking about, the elephant in the room, enemy number one. We're talking about a problem that for the most part has to do with poverty, chronic poverty. So the images that are on TV about civil wars and Afghanistan and this and that are not why people don't have enough to eat. It's about just chronic poverty, subsistence farmers. So it is a huge child health problem, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we see people who die because they don't have enough to eat. Whereas in Asia or South America, we would see people who don't reach their physical or intellectual potential.
So South Asia, you would see people who grow but maybe stunted or developmentally disabled in some way because of hunger, whereas in Africa, they simply die.
Yeah, in Africa, it's a more acute food shortage.
Yeah. How big, anything you want to add to that, Hannah?
I agree entirely. We've all seen the terrible commercials of the starving children and everything, and I'm not trying to say that they aren't legitimate or cause for concern, but witnessing firsthand the extent, that hunger has on the effect of a child, not only their physical development and their mental development, but also just their sense of spirit and person. I've seen a lot of kids and adults as well that had to make serious compromises in their life, going off of poverty in order to be able to put food on the table. I agree that poverty is just like the main issue that spurs along the hunger. It's like a never-ending cycle, and a lot of the children tripping over my words. A lot of the children I interacted with had to either attend school and receive a meal a day, or forego going to school in order to work so that they could put food on the table. And like Dr. Maneri says, poverty just really fuels world hunger and malnutrition.
Now, I understand the importance of poverty, but I think also of growing conditions, drought, where the food supply fails. Mm-hmm. I think of lack of infrastructure so that food may spoil before it can be transported. Yeah, I think of unstable governments. How do those fit into the problem of poverty? Not only unstable governments, failed states, or corrupt states, or worst case, North Korea, which is simply indescribable.
True. I can't speak to the political, aspects of that. My knowledge is very limited, I have to admit, and so I know just what I saw. But I mean,
well, what about you, Mark?
I would, Jim, truthfully discount those as major players on the scope of the world. Okay. I think I don't know how many folks here have read the book or something about the book End of Poverty. Any people? Yeah. There they describe a cycle that when poverty becomes so extreme, people are just living day to day. They're using all the resources to go to the clinic because their kid has a fever, and then they're using all the resources to buy dinner, sure. And there's no capacity for them to say, plan for tomorrow, plan for next week, plan for next year. When I mention that about chronic poverty, the other 20% of hunger in the world is disaster, and those can be droughts or wars or, oppressive governments starving folks. But it's really less glamorous or exciting than that. It's
How I can understand feeding people. The Danforth Foundation, not the foundation, the Plant Science Center sends packages of food. You pack them yourselves.
Yes, sir.
Other countries provide food. Can we reduce to the vanishing point poverty? Or in the absence of a cure for poverty, how do we respond successfully, sustainably, to child malnutrition, child hunger?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. I am not unhopeful about getting rid of poverty. If we think about how many of us are old enough in this room to remember East Pakistan in 1971, and this had this terrible civil war, and we said, how could anything good happen in this place? It is so densely populated. I mean, right now, there's 140 million people in a place much smaller than Missouri. Well, they have begun to break that cycle of poverty. There's opportunities for folks. Now, I know this is a bit of a controversial thing to say, but the production of many of the brand name clothes in the world comes from Dhaka, 22 million people. But that kind of opportunity, even though that may feel limited, has offered people in that society as a whole to begin to break that cycle at the bottom from going hand to mouth, day to day, minute to minute, and get on a ladder. Now, is that ladder going to take generations or decades? Yes, of course. But I'm not of the mindset that this is just inevitable, this is just the way life is, and let's watch the ball game or something. I think that poverty can be decreased and obliterated.
Presumably then you see at least a sort of a two-step operation. One is to focus on poverty, but the other is to immediately help the malnourished, starving children.
Sure. As a humanitarian, when we see a crisis, when we see a place in the world suffering, I think it's a very natural reaction. We're having that reaction now with the floods in Memphis and Mississippi and many times a year to go and to rescue and to help. I personally engage and applaud in those kind of efforts, but my ambition, if you will call it, professional ambition or ambition in life at all, is to fix malnutrition for kids in Africa. And so part of that's going to have to be something that prevents this problem. And really, when we're talking about very rudimentary food production systems, very, agriculture that hasn't changed for 150 years, 100 years, that's a place that we can really make a difference, which is why I'm working with projects here at the Danforth Plant Science Center.
I think of lots of things. One, here at the Plant Science Center, we're working to make cassava more nutritious. One can imagine also subsidizing farmers to help them pay for fertilizer, to help them pay for new seed. I know the World Bank doesn't like that, but America subsidizes its farmers, often to the detriment of farmers overseas if we can underprice them. How can we help agriculture, which is a two-strike? It produces food and it alleviates poverty. Can we help the farmers in Africa? Or is it too general to speak of Africa? There are a lot of countries in Africa.
It is true.
How much experience? You've been in Tanzania. You work in Malawi. Are there bright spots and then dim bulbs?
Where I was, yeah. I was in a very rural town. We didn't have running water. We had very sketchy electricity, meaning it went on one night out of every 5. So it was very, very isolated, which is what I liked. In regards to agriculture and farming, I didn't have any firsthand experience, on a farm with a hoe or anything, but I did have the privilege of meeting a lot of the shopkeepers in the market and the farmers themselves. And I asked them, through a translator, because I know no Swahili, I asked them, like, how do you grow your crops? Like, how do you prepare for the next season? And they told me, they say, we take it one day at a time. They had a very serious drought while I was there, which just wiped out a bunch of the corn crops, which is a huge concern because corn, like in America, is a basic staple of their diet. And the farmers told me, they said, we go day to day, we don't know what to expect, they don't use pesticides, they have limited access to fertilizers, so the crops are more susceptible to disease, which the Danforth Plant Science Center is working to eliminate. But the farmers just literally live off the land, and they don't have the state of mind to think, a year or decade in advance to plan for the future, and thus
And I have read that much of the agricultural land in Africa is exhausted with little organic
entirely.
matter and almost incapable of growing crops.
I had talked to a few farmers, and they say how they almost nomadically move from plot of land to plot of land because there's no crop rotation, because their space is what they've got. They have not a lot of riches and wealth, and land being one of them. And so once they've completely, like you said, exhausted that space of land, it's unusable.
I mean, Jim, that's the case actually of the whole world. We really don't have room in this planet to just go and create a whole bunch of new farms doing business as usual and increase the food production. So it's in Africa, I think it's a little more front and center. It's still a continent where more than half the people, 60% of the people, are subsistence farmers. They live in rural areas. Urbanization has occurred in most other places in the world. But when we think about a planet now which maybe has 7 billion people, we're easily looking at 9 billion people.
And maybe 10.
And we don't, today we're kind of about right here in a balanced state with food production and food needs. I mean, something's going to have to happen with new technology to keep up with this.
Well, I think that's a crucial observation because there's not an infinite supply of water. We have a relatively fixed amount of land, and agricultural land is being lost. We have an unstable climate that will certainly have an effect on agricultural productivity. So new technology, new kinds of crops, new ways of farming. One of the provocative phrases I often think about is, what's the carrying capacity of the earth? We've been able to sustain kind of 7 billion, but 9, 10, 11, we have to be able to produce more and distribute it. There's now, we haven't talked at all about food waste, which ranges from inadequate storage facilities, so spoilage and pilferage by vermin in Africa, to food waste in this country that's just overprepared and then pitched. But food waste, I have read that we grow enough now to feed everybody. But with the inadequate infrastructure, the inadequate refrigeration, the amount of waste, we don't feed everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on a lot of problems, and that's really important for the big picture, because this problem of not enough to eat or hunger worldwide is going to have 50 or 100 solutions, because think about the multifacets of it, all the different places, all the different causes, all the different elements.
I know.
So it's going to have, you mentioned something about vermin, I mean, I'm sure you may know, rats eat 25% of the cereals in Africa. Can we do something about that?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a huge issue. How many people could you feed if you weren't feeding the rats?
Let's eat rats.
Well, they do. In Malawi, that's certainly, I was just looking at a food frequency survey today of some kids, and that's the most common animal source food they eat, mice.
I've eaten their bushy-tailed cousins called squirrels because they eat my vegetables. But the food waste is a big issue, and it can't be readily transported to market or sold as easily. Are there written questions beginning to come in? Oh, good. There's Laura dashing to the floor. Well, I'm glad, Mark, that you mentioned the multiplicity of problems, because I see childhood malnutrition as existing. It's part of a broader context. You can find senior citizens in this country who are isolated, who have limited income, who suffer from food insecurity. In Greece, which is going through a big depression, I read that in a food pantry that was set up in Athens, where a few hundred people came a couple of years ago, now 3,500 people are coming to get food. That's a different kind of problem, but it's still a food insecurity problem. You can find pockets of poverty in this country thanks to our recession or depression, and talk to the food pantries in this country, and they're seeing more business in St. Louis than they saw in 2006 or 2005. So that the child nutrition, as big as it is only one facet of a big and complicated problem.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see what we've got here. When you say, this is one particularly for you, Mark. When you say that people die from malnutrition, what does that mean? Do they become ill, contract diseases, or I would add, simply fade away?
So as your body loses the stores of nutrients, it loses function. So many of you have heard said, we only need 10% of our lungs to live, or 10% of our kidney function. Well, what happens when starvation is if you started at 100, it's gonna dribble down till basically a variety of organ systems don't work. And one of those organ systems could be the immune system, and we could be more susceptible to infections. Another organ system would be the liver, where we don't process out toxins from our environment so well. So for the most part, infections are the common disease of kids, so that would be the most reason that kids would die. You mentioned sort of a spectrum of age. I mean, at least in Africa, that's really the only place I can speak to. I've just been in Asia in a few weeks and don't have very many projects going on there or something. But I always wondered why all the kids who came for treatment were 1 to 3. You didn't see their 4-year-old brother, and you didn't see their mother, and you didn't see their school-aged sibling, and I lived in a village in '99 for 10 weeks, and I saw what I thought would be the answer to that. So kids who are under 1 are breastfed, and that's a good food, and they don't fall into dire straits with it. Kids that are over 3 spend their days hanging around with other kids and forage very effectively for food. So they know there's going to be mealtime at their house at a certain time, maybe 12, but they know neighbors may be feeding at 11, someone else may be feeding at 1, and they will effectively go around and find enough food. It's the 1 to 3-year-old is the one who's with their mother appropriately and dependent on their mother to feed them all the time.
And if the mother is starving, can she feed the children? Can they breastfeed if she's starving?
She can. What's interesting about breastfeeding is it's in Africa anyway, it's on demand. So in other words, the child is with you every minute, and the child cries when they're hungry. And what we found is that children that feed a lot more during the day, like let's say children who feed 20 times a day, their mother isn't making milk with very many nutrients in it, so they're just asking to be fed more often and more often and more often, and the kid will usually demand to get what they need from breast milk.
And they'll get what they need.
Yep, they may be feeding all the time, but they'll get it.
Here's one for you, Hannah. How do I inspire my child to get involved with World Food Day?
Well, if you're looking to specifically involve them with World Food Day, I mean, whoever you are, can I see a hand? Sorry, I don't mean to pick you out. But anyways, if you're out there, I would have no problem if you'd want to shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to your child and just, share my experience with them. But the fact that really got me hooked on World Food Day was the fact that you can feed 6 children or 4 adults for $1.50. That will provide them with a nutritious, filling meal. Tastes great, they love it, and we know that it works. The children are healthy that receive the meals in the feeding center I worked at. And, once I just got that stat and that number, I stopped grabbing my morning coffee, and I would put, like a few quarters in a container for World Food Day. But I think one thing that really appealed to me and my friends was the fact that it was easy. it was something that we could do hands-on. We were packaging the meals, like we knew where they were going, and we saw what was being put in the meals. We weren't writing a check and sending it off to an organization. I'm not trying to delegitimize that. That's a wonderful cause as well. But just the bare bones of it, that's really what appeals to people. I know that's what got my friends hooked, and once you know that you can feed 6 children or 4 adults for $1.50, then for most people, hopefully that'll resonate with them.
Yeah, you've emphasized the low cost a couple of times, so I can't resist asking, does that include the transportation cost?
It does.
To get it from here to there?
$1.50 for the food, the production, the packaging, and the shipping. So it's a flat.
Would it be cheaper if you bought the food over there and didn't have to ship it anywhere?
Actually, let's see. I did all the shopping, being as I was one of the main cooks for the mission trip. So I had the privilege of going into the market. I know I'm getting so excited about this, I'm sorry. I had the privilege of going into the market twice a day and buying vegetables. And they were moderately priced. I mean, like if you were going to Walmart, and let's say, I think at Walmart, like tomatoes are about 43 cents each. I know because I'm there twice a week. But over there in Tanzania, they're about 35 cents each. So it's not terribly less expensive. I mean, given the exchange rate, you'd be paying about the same. But I think the fact that we're able to consolidate the nutrients, and rice is the main staple, and
Sure.
rice is a very inexpensive, readily available product, and it's the basis of many diets, Africa being one of them, speaking as a whole. And actually the rice is grown in Missouri that we put in the food packages. So you're supporting local business as well for those teenagers who are into fair trade like I am. So it's another plus.
Good. Now here's a question that may be for you, Jim Carrington. Will World Food Day continue in the future? If so, what are the goals for packaging? Yes is the answer.
Dates and information are on our website.
Okay.
And we have goals, and they're a little higher than what we did last year.
Okay. So Jim's not wired up, so this Jim said yes, World Food Day will continue. You can get information on dates and activities on the Plant Science Center website, and the goals are somewhat higher than they were last year. You're probably raising the bar, Hannah, because of all your enthusiasm.
Oh man. Yes, our goal last year was 200,000 meals, and at the late 19 packaging, we actually made 207,000, at which point I almost burst into tears. I was so happy. And we eventually packaged 355,000 meals, excuse me, and this year our goal is around 500,000. So, I know, I'm excited.
There you go.
Super.
Yeah.
Dr. Maneri, this one's for you. Why Malawi? Am I pronouncing that right? Malawi?
Malawi.
Malawi.
Yeah. Why Malawi?
Why Malawi?
So,
And why not here? Aren't people here in the U.S. hungry? I'd say not nearly as many, but
I would say that when I talk about malnutrition, I'm probably way out there on an extreme realm, in kids dying and something. I mean, having been working at Children's Hospital for 25 years, we pull the fire alarm when children are much less malnourished, where they wouldn't qualify for being severely malnourished by international standards, and do all kinds of interventions. So I don't think there's that problem, but it's not about, like, I was on a search for where there's malnutrition. Let me go find this place, kind of thing. It's more, I was in Malawi on a faculty exchange program, and I said, what's the biggest problem here to address? Oh, here it's about kids not having enough to eat. That's from a personal point of view. Why Malawi has this terrible problem is a bit historical. Malawi's a little place about the size of Missouri. It's got a big lake about the size of Lake Michigan, which is pristine and clean, and you can drink the water out of the lake. It's very densely populated compared to other countries around there. Probably 6, 7, 8 people to 1 compared to other countries around there. Because in the colonial days, before 1960, this was a backwater. So if you didn't want to be hassled and tortured and pestered by colonialists, you came to Malawi, and people could move freely all across borders. Now, these independence movements came, borders become walls, people can't leave the country, and there we have a very densely populated place that can't, that's using every bit of land, but really can't support its folks. So
It's population.
yeah, in terms of food production. It's landlocked, low level of education, so you can look at a place like Bangladesh and say they don't support their food production either, but they've got a big port and they've got some industrial kind of infrastructure. I mean, we know that there was a miracle in Bangalore 15 years ago with a fiber optic cable. I mean, something like that could potentially transform places like Malawi. But it will be something on that way to go, big. But in terms of agriculture, there's a lot of room for improvement, what I see there in Malawi, for sure. You mentioned an interesting thought, which actually has been implemented in Malawi for the last 5 years. So rather than the government spending money on food aid, they have put all that into purchasing fertilizer and selling it at a subsidized price. And so the staple crop there is corn, and corn, the units I might have a little bit wrong, but the annual production of corn is 18 billion bushels or something. But with this fertilizer subsidy, that goes up immediately to 27. That goes up by a factor of 1.5. That gives people some more leeway. So it's not so many people, not that that fixes the problem. That's all we have to do, fertilizer subsidy, see you later. But it, those kind of interventions can be helpful.
I know Dr. Maneri is the peanut butter doctor, and food packaging is also a stopgap. How do we effectively feed people long term? Now, I don't know how long term is.
Are we speaking in terms of African time? Because for them, long term is like the next week, just from experience. Or do you mean like long term, American standard, sustainable, dependable farming and food resources?
Well, to use I'm on risky territory here with an MD right beside me, but to use an example, it's how do you get rid of the incidence of a disease so that people are just healthy and they no longer in large numbers get dysentery or cholera or any one of a number of other diseases? How do you, on the one hand, get people well if they're sick, and on the other, how do you significantly reduce the incidence of the problem? So here, to come back to the food, we know we have to feed people short term, but how can we get past that so they're simply well fed?
True. Speaking from experience, the people there they don't really care what happens tomorrow. They need their food for the day. And so they do think long term. And the number one way we can sort of alleviate that, and if not change it, is to certainly educate them and provide them with more knowledge about sustainable farming, as well as the importance of reliable nutrition to encourage childhood development, because they don't know that. I worked in the hospital, and it was amazing how completely ignorant some of the people were about the diseases they had or the ways they could contract them. They're still just now learning about ways to prevent the spread of AIDS, which is something that we all think we can take for granted, but they're still learning over there. And I actually had to teach a few adults, not to do this, not to do that, how to prevent the spread of this. And I had to teach a few mothers how to breastfeed, which was the first for me, having no mothering experience whatsoever. And helping the doctors explain the importance of breastfeeding your child. I mean, you can speak more to that, being as I'm not a pediatrician or a mom. Thank goodness, not yet. But knowledge, they need that. And I think once we educate them and get them motivated to promote good, then they're going to be able to go out and make the changes necessary.
Your comment about having to teach people, deliver information, gets to this question. Dr. Maneri, you talked about poverty being the elephant in the room. Can you speak to the issue of education in Africa? That will need to go hand in hand with more food to control population.
I mean, sometimes people, people have heard me before will say that it's a problem about poverty and not about ignorance. And we have decades of experience with millions of people being educated about things like dietary diversity and proper child feeding and et cetera, and we have very, very little to show for it. So I'm going to come down on the side, a very unpopular side, that is not really going to emphasize a lot about education. I mean, the role of education may be to equip people for a different kind of job that might be, be more economically advantageous to them. But it really isn't, in my experience, and I've been living in Africa probably half of the last 25 years, in rural southern and eastern Africa, about ignorance or something. It's about just can't make ends meet, and the opportunities just aren't in place there to do that. Your question about, how can this be fixed in the long term? It doesn't have an answer. We said earlier, it's going to have something to do with better agriculture and more economic development. It's going to have to do with, populations, urbanization of populations. It's going to have to do with a lot of things. But one thing I'm absolutely sure about is you can't get blood from a stone. You can't make something from nothing. So if we don't have the food on the planet, we're not going to be able to feed people, because most of the way people get food is from, agriculture, mostly growing plants, somewhat eating animals. I mean, it's not going to be some other way that's going to happen.
You hit at two things that we haven't come up yet this evening, but I want to raise. One is the challenge of using food for fuel. I think of ethanol, I think of biodiesel. Are we using up food supply in the interest of energy? And the second question I've forgotten. But the food for fuel, is that an issue?
Well, it does impact food prices a bit. So when we talk about, a couple years ago, food prices were at an all-time high in the spring. I think it was 2008 or so, and now they're approaching that level again. So demand for, say, some crops being made into biofuels does affect food prices. And one thing that's really true, even though people can't move around and immigrate from one part of the world to another, but in this world, in 2011, goods move pretty freely. And so the price of oil or rice or other commodities really doesn't vary a whole lot, from St. Louis to Tonga, where she was, or Manila. So, goods will move to where they're going to be getting the best price for that.
Price.
I think that this is one of the major, causes at the root of why we have hunger in the world? No, because this is a fairly new phenomenon. And I don't think that we should stop, we're going to do anything good by trying to stop that. I think we need to be effective about having plants that make biofuels and plants that make enough food.
Well, algae, which is being worked on here in the Plant Science Center, is not a particular food crop, but algae can be turned into fuel, which may make more sense than turning corn into fuel, or beans as far as that's concerned. The other question I was going to ask that I've read about occasionally has to do with the amount of grain that goes into beef cattle to respond to the increasing desire for meat as people's economic condition becomes better. I've read that beef takes about 10 pounds of grain to make a pound of beef, maybe 5 pounds to make a pound of pork, and chicken maybe chicken and fish are the most efficient consumers. But if we ate less meat, would that have a positive impact on the price of food?
It might. I think that it's a confluence of factors, that animal source foods are very rich in nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And probably, certainly people like me don't need to eat much meat, but 2-year-olds and 1-year-olds won't develop well if they don't eat animal source foods. So you're right that grain is, it takes 4 or 5 times the amount of grain to create a pound of meat or something. But I don't think I don't think that's why we're in this bind we are today, that we have now China and India wanting to consume more and more meat. We'll see.
And use more and more fuel.
Yes, for sure.
Here's a question that I suspect you've never been asked. It's a new one, but I think it's an interesting one. So many children in the U.S. have been identified as having a peanut allergy. Do you find this to be true in the countries you visit, especially those places where your peanut butter-based RUTF is used?
So absolutely not. So food allergy in sort of very broad strokes is in good part a product of growing up in a society where you're not exposed to too many germs. So we've got an immune system in our bodies when we're first born that's looking for work, and it's looking around the environment to see what germs the young child is exposed to. And so if you're not exposed to very many germs in the first 9 months of life, then your immune system finds other things to react to, and one of them can be food. So in context where there's plenty of germs around, you never see food allergies.
So that's not a problem in Malawi.
And secondly, breastfeeding is protective against food allergy, and we're talking about the poorest populations in the world are what we call exclusively breastfed, or breastfed on demand. So there's no limit to the amount of breast milk a mother will give a child in the poorest societies in the world.
But what you seem to be saying is if parents keep their house really clean, their kid will have allergies.
I think that's a contributing factor. I think that there's nothing wrong with instead of laying on a clean blanket and playing with little plastic toys on your back when you're 6 months of age, to be laying on the ground and sticking your hands in dirt.
Although the dirt is always more fun.
Just today, my dentist asked me if I was allergic to anything, and I said no. I don't want to know how I was raised. Hannah, this one is for you. How has your work with the World Food Day and your trip to Africa affected your global perspective?
Affected my global perspective. Well, I had the fortune of growing up in England overseas as a result of my dad's work, and I was exposed to many different cultures, and I traveled a lot as a child. And so for me, skipping 3 weeks of junior year to head on over to Africa by myself was truly not that big of a deal. But in regards to the experience I had on broadening my global perspective, I was definitely exposed to things I wouldn't have if I were here. I'm someone who likes to be very mentally stimulated and learn new things, and I'm always going out to find new opportunities for myself. And I think immersing myself in the culture for 3 weeks did that. I was exposed to extreme levels of poverty, disease that I couldn't even fathom until I witnessed it firsthand. The malnutrition was just rampant, and I couldn't find it acceptable. And all of these things really hit me and resonated with me, and I understood, just how small I was in this world and that I can still make a difference. And it just really encouraged me to want to get out, do more, learn more, and help as many people as I could. And it really just, broadened my perspective on life and made me want to just go out and do. So.
And Mark, this one, what do you hope to accomplish through your collaboration with the Danforth Center?
So very specifically, I've been working with the Cassava Project for 6 or 7 years, and what we hope to accomplish there is to introduce cassava in the next decade, and probably in 5, 6, 7 years or so, in Nigeria and Kenya and Uganda, and then other countries around there, with ample amounts of protein and iron and vitamin A, all nutrients that these cassava consuming populations need. I have the good fortune to have a lab as well, and I think Isabel's here, but she's working on putting enhanced amounts of folate and iron in peanuts, which are also they're a staple crop more in West Africa, in Senegal and Gambia and Mali and places like that. And so the issue of children dying from malnutrition is usually what we call a macronutrient issue. It's about calories, it's about protein, it's about fat. But beyond that, when you get to meeting that box of need, you can look to a place like South America, where we see lots of folks who are short and haven't reached their sort of physical and intellectual capacity. And they had plenty of macronutrients to eat when they were kids and when they were adults, but they were missing some of these micronutrients, some of these vitamins and minerals.
Well, take that a step further. If a child is missing vitamin A, how will that exhibit?
Well, it just makes your childhood more risky. So you're more likely to to die from an infection. Does everybody die from an infection? No, but it just makes your life more risky in that sense. A very small number of folks with vitamin A deficiency, very severe, would be, have a blindness or eyesight problem. But for the most part, these kinds of they call this hidden hunger, this micronutrient, because it doesn't come out and do something, obvious and deforming right in front of your face on it.
Okay. Well, this may be a secret. What are the ingredients in your RUTF? What needs do the components meet? How important is protein in these diets? And my addition to that would be, do you add micronutrients, vitamin A, iron, whatever, to the RUTF, particularly if you're using peanuts that don't have them, those micronutrients abundantly?
For sure. So RUTF in one way feels simple: peanut butter, sugar, oil, some milk powder, and some micronutrients. But it's got 40 different micronutrients added to it, and it's designed, if you will, to meet the needs of a malnourished child to recovery. So what that means is that you or I or your kids or something, young kids in our society, have a certain amount of each nutrients they should meet every day to kind of meet their requirements. When you're severely malnourished, basically looking at a situation where you have facing a 2/3 chance of dying if something isn't done. So, if any of us were sitting here saying, well, in the next month I have a 2/3 chance of dying, I mean, we'd call that, hospice, and you'd be in the emergency room or something. But so RUTF is scientifically formulated to deliver everything that's needed. Okay, so in that way it's not just sort of something made up in your kitchen and this and that. Now, we did strive to put the macronutrients into being things that could be obtained locally, because as you brought it up earlier, local availability and transportation is an issue. Mm-hmm. And if something is available locally, then it's going to be used more locally, for sure. Food packets can be made here at the Danforth Center and taken to Tonga, but that's a more complicated chain that involves a variety of different players than, say, something produced locally that a family would just get in their local community.
Thank you. I think we've just about reached our appointed time.
We have.
Bill, do you want to say a few words?
Just a few words. First of all, thanks to all the people for coming for a marvelous conversations. It's really been very exciting and very inspiring. Second, I want to thank the volunteers who put this together. The conversation series volunteers are led by Matt Wolf, and I want to thank all of them for helping us to have such amazing presentations. Then Howard Buffett was in town speaking recently, and he said something that related a bit, helped one see a bit one of the points that Mark was making. He was talking about the environment and saving the environment. He said, no man ever starved to death to save a tree. So the first thing one has to do is to make sure that people are well fed. And finally, I want to thank Jim Davis for, as always, doing a terrific job. And I want to thank our two panelists for being with us today and doing a very special presentation. Aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky? And aren't we lucky to live in a world where there are people who see a need and want to meet it, and who recognize the world's greatest problem and want to run to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to leave you all with a couple of sentences that I think are optimistic. In February, The Economist had a special report on hunger and agriculture in the world. It was a very good report, but I want to share with you the last 3 sentences. Countries from Brazil to Vietnam have shown that, given the right technology, sensible policies, and a bit of luck, they can transform themselves from basket cases to bread baskets. That surely is cause for optimism. I think there's room to be optimistic, but we have a long way to go. Thank you for being here.